Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, here I see. Super. Okay, the Neuroscience and Humanities Lab is honored today to host two international authorities on the topic of theater, cognition, and embodiment, Bruce McConachie and Rick Kemp. I'm sure that many among us have had the pleasure of reading some of their seminal books and manuscripts that have characterized this interdisciplinary field of research. Today, they will talk about empathy, emotion, and narrative, actors and audiences in action. And first of all, thank you both for accepting our invitation. And I'm very happy to introduce Professor Bruce McConachie. Bruce McConachie, recently Emeritus Professor in Theater Arts at the University of Pittsburgh, has written several books that combine cognitive and historical investigation. This began in 2003 with the American Theater in the Culture of the Cold War, which applies Lakoff and Johnson's work to analyze Cold War America. And with Engaging Audiences, a cognitive approach to spectating in the theater in 2008, McConachie looked at several aspects of audience behavior through the lens of cognitive psychology. Working within the paradigm of enaction, he broadened his scope in evolution, cognition, and performance in 2015 to include the evolution of performances and included rituals, dance, music, stand-up comedy, and film. His latest book, Drama, Politics, and Evolution, Clear Dynamics in Play, published last year, merges historical and evolutionary understanding with an activism to explore how a range of dramatic performances in many media, from hunter-gatherer rituals to the internet, gave voice and legitimacy to various political regimes in our species' history, from the Pleistocene to today. Please, Vittorio.
Yeah, it is my privilege to introduce our second guest this afternoon, Richard Kemp. Welcome. Richard Kemp has over 30 years of international experience as an actor and director, receiving the Institut Français Award for Theatre, the British Telecom Innovations Award, and the Heinz Endowment's Creative Aids Award in the USA. He was the founder and joint artistic director of London's Commotion Theatre Company, creating shows that were selected as critics' choices by Time Out London and The Guardian. Richard Kemp is a fellow of the Salzburg Global Seminar on Neuroscience and Art and is professor of theater and head of acting and directing at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Publications from Richard Kemp include Embodied Acting, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Performance, 2012, The Rutledge Companion to Jacques Lecoq, 2016, and The Rutledge Companion to Theater, Performance, and Cognitive Science, 2019. So please, now the floor is yours. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and we really appreciate the initiative you've taken to bring the humanities and the sciences together.
Yes, I join Rick in thanking both of you. It's been a lot of fun as well to get to work with Rick again. We've done some shows together as actor and director, as well as collaborating quite often on some of our work. So I'm delighted to be joining all of you.
Likewise.
I would add one more thing. Please, Rick and I have quite a bit to say, for better or for worse. Please hold your questions until we have finished. It will all go much more smoothly if we can do it that way. Thank you.
Sure.
Super.
So to begin, I'll talk briefly about some aspects of acting process so that it can be understood in the context of the phenomenological level of embodied simulation, in which we understand the actions and emotions of others by experiential sharing through mirror systems. How is it that actors create behavior that is apparently real enough to prompt this response in audience members? Actors seek to elicit and regulate cognitive processes that generally happen in daily life with little or no conscious direction. It is in the realm of these cognitive activities, as well as through the physically evident areas of voice, facial expressions, posture, gesture, and movement, that an actor's technique operates. When technique is successful, it becomes invisible, which leads many onlookers to assume that the apparent naturalness of behavior in the fictional circumstances of a drama is an implicit talent. In fact, this naturalness is generally the result of long and painstaking preparation in which actors use conscious choices to create memorized behavior that is apparently spontaneous. This preparation begins with an analysis of the drama as a whole to provide the context for an imaginative connection with the character. In the same way that readers of a novel are prompted into feeling, actors reading a script and imagining its context engage with the affective responses of their fictional character. The difference between a reader of a novel and an actor is that the actor must move into a first-person perspective to embody the character for an audience. To do this, actors divide their own character's dialogue into segments of varying length. Actors define these segments, often called beats, according to the moment-to-moment intent of the character, also called task, goal, or objective. Imagining themselves as if they are the character, they ask, what do I want at this moment, in order to gain this first-person perspective within the fiction? Having defined a goal, they ask, what do I do to get what I want? The answers to these questions are known as actions, defined with transitive verbs such as I persuade, I deceive, I intimidate, and so on. The verbs are assimilated in the memorization process and expressed through non-verbal channels to confirm, modify, or even contradict the verbal meaning of the script, thus communicating implicit intent and unspoken feelings. This process of defining and expressing goal-oriented actions is deeply congruent with the understanding that conceptual thought reuses sensory motor neural patterns and that language is action-based. The detailed specificity of behavior created by the actor's process provides the basis for empathy and emotion within a fictional narrative.
To discuss what actors and audiences do with empathy, emotion, and narrative, we'll be using Shakespeare's Henry V, staged initially in 1599. Specifically, we'll look at scenes from the 1989 film of the play, directed by and starring Kenneth Branagh. Following the action of the drama, the film climaxes in the Battle of Agincourt, and we'll begin our discussion showing about 3.5 minutes of Branagh's battle scene. Historically, the 1415 battle between the English and French monarchies was part of the 100 Years' War toward the end of the Middle Ages. As you'll see, Branagh draws on general knowledge of the battle to depict the famous English victory against numerically superior French forces as the result of English archers raining down thousands of arrows on the advancing French. The English waited to charge and then moved in to finish the fight after their arrows had decimated French forces. We can start the film now. As you watch, try to imagine what empathy, emotion, and narrative have to do with how the actors rehearsed and performed the scene, and how these embodied practices help the film spectators to experience and understand it. I think the film is coming
Why, all our ranks are broke.
Unpardonable shame.
Shame and eternal shame. Nothing but shame.
So at the beginning of this extract, we see the French knights placed to the right of the frame begin to charge toward the left of the frame. The point of view switches to a silent Henry with ranks of English soldiers who are facing frame right. The rumble of the approaching mounted onslaught gradually enters the soundscape, creating the sense that the silent faces observed by the camera are themselves observing a deadly charge. The actors playing the king, his knights, and his soldiers appear to watch the out-of-frame French charge. In the shooting of the film, it is highly unlikely that this charge is actually taking place. The actors have to imagine the charge and make action choices in the fictional circumstances. An example of the specificity of action that I described earlier can be seen in Branagh Henry's response. His eyes sustain their focus on a single point. He breathes in as if controlling an involuntary gasp, and then raises his eyebrows. This cluster of nonverbal signals suggest fear and surprise, reiterated in various ways by the other faces that successively fill the frame, potentially prompting similar feelings in the audience through the phenomenological level of embodied simulation. Branagh Henry is poised to react as the sound of the charge grows louder and more distinct, prompting the audience to imagine the French knights getting closer. A series of shots of English soldiers looking towards Henry heighten the tension before he gives the signal to unleash the arrows. A separate shot shows the sky filled with arrows. Another different shot shows the descending arrows landing in the grounds and striking and killing French soldiers. These shots create a short narrative sequence in which the arrows are the protagonist, fittingly, as the English longbows were believed to be the decisive factor in the English victory. The directorial choices link the different shots through a sense of cause and effect to create a spatially ordered narrative sequence. The French knights charge from right to left, Henry and his nobles charge from left to right, and the arrows follow a singular directional path from left to right towards their goal. We see multiple examples of the source, path, goal schema that Bruce will describe later, with visible actions implying narrative intentions. The arrival of the arrows coincides with the complete disruption of the previous spatial order and a temporal compression of actions. Branagh Henry has raised his sword to command the firing of the arrows, then starts a downward slashing movement to begin the English charge. The editing of the film completes the slashing movement through a jump cut to a different shot in which the sword descends onto an enemy shield. This editing creates effect through our ability to infer the goal of a physical action, even when we see only a part of it. Viewers experience a sense of acceleration, as we would when affected by the adrenaline of combat. In the shots of this combat, the screen is filled with multiple fighting bodies that have no apparent spatial organization. In the film, these sequences of action express the disorder that the Constable of France has referred to when he says, "Disorder hath spoiled us," in Act 4, Scene 5, a line that is not used in the film. In the initial stages of the battle, when heraldic insignia are not visible, it's hard to tell who is fighting for the French or for the English. Within this chaos, we suddenly see clarity of allegiance in two characters, Pistol and Nym, who are in it for themselves, taking no part in the fighting and robbing the dead and wounded as the battle rages. The actors playing these characters emphasize their dissociation from their English compatriots through choices of action that direct posture, visual focus, and physical actions towards the bodies that they are robbing, turning their backs to the surrounding combat, both literally and metaphorically. This stark juxtaposition of self-interest with allegiance to a group, soldiers fighting for their country, continues a theme that has been present throughout the preceding narrative. The self-interest leads to Nim's death without honor, with an implicit moral message. Shortly after Nim's death, the Constable of France is unseated from his horse. As the Dauphin and French nobles run to rescue him from the mud, the film changes to slow motion, with a different register and tempo in the musical underscoring, creating a significant change of tone from the frenzy of battle. In the slow motion sequence, focus is given to the slashing, hacking, and stabbing actions of the actor characters engaged in combat. Sounds of blades piercing flesh are prominent above the sounds of battle and the musical score. A sequence of deaths are shown in a gruesome level of detail that wasn't visible when the combat raged in real time, making evident the physical harm to combatants on both sides. This temporarily expands the scope of the viewer's empathic identification, previously focused on Henry and the English soldiers, but now expanded to humans in general, regardless of their allegiance. And over to you, Bruce.
Yeah, unmute Bruce, please.
Still muted, I'm afraid.
Raffa, lo puoi smutare, per favore?
Sì, teniamoli on, se no è un...
È in grado di farlo, Bruce, in realtà. È assolutamente autonomo. Adesso vedo.
Can you unmute yourself? You should click on the mic icon.
The mic icon on the screen. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I think we can hear you now.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Rick. As you'll see, Rick and I share similar approaches to many of the fundamentals of empathy, emotion, and narrative, but we'll sometimes emphasize different aspects of these embodied practices and build upon them in separate ways to understand their implications. Before getting to the audience's emotionally fearful and empathically gripping response to the battle itself, I'd like to talk first about narrative. I'll be using Lakoff and Johnson's image schemas, some phenomenology, a bit of Torben Grodal's film theory, but I want to begin with an overarching theory that synthesizes these and other approaches. Philosopher Stephen Asma published his The Evolution of Imagination in 2017, and has been fleshing out the scientific and epistemological implications of his ideas for the last 4 years. In the fall of 2021, the editors of the journal Evolutionary Studies in Imaginary Culture featured Asma's summary of his work as their lead essay, followed by comments from 10 other scholars, most of whom celebrated his synthesis. In brief, Asma rejects the dominant model of cognitive science, which seeks to discover a framework of objective impersonal laws for an understanding of cognition that is, as he states, evolutionarily conserved. Asma terms his perspective mythopoetic cognitive science, and one of its prominent features is an emphasis on what he calls dramatically organized schema. that derive from our evolution as a species and help us to organize and predict our experiences. I want to underline predict because, as we know, prediction has become an important point of discussion among cog scientists. Here's a longer quote from Asma's essay that helps to explain what he means. Quote, "The world we live in is dramatic. Our everyday world is a story of struggle, failure, overcoming enemies and challenges, forging alliances, nurturing children, hoping, dreaming, hunting, being hunted. This is as true for my local librarian and mail carrier as it is for the Kalahari Bushmen and Aboriginal Arrente people. Within mythopoetic cognition, I am the protagonist of my life, just as you are of yours." From Asma's point of view, the general narrative of Henry V is a story with deep roots in our Pleistocene past. Two tribes, let's call them the French tribe and the English tribe, are fighting over rights to control land, of course. Several Shakespearean scholars have noted the popularity of Henry, that the popularity of Henry V heralds the rise of English nationalism under Queen Elizabeth, but it's equally valid to see Agincourt and the Hundred Years' War as yet another instance of the eruption of prehistoric tribalism among rival bands of humans. Asma draws on Patrick Hogan and others to discuss the universality of stories among all human cultures. I would add that Mark Johnson's understanding of the general structure of narratives works well with Asma's and Hogan's insights. Stories replicate the shape of what Johnson called the universal image schema of source, path, goal. It's likely that this image schema emerged early in the Pleistocene among hunter-gatherers as a result of repeated daily journeys. This journey began with a source, their temporary campground, commenced on a path as our ancestors left the camp to seek game and edible plants for their hominin band, and ended with a goal when they returned to the campfire to share their food and stories. Finally, let's think again about the usual generic name of the play. To call it a history drama is, of course, formally correct, but Torben Grodal understands movie narratives about war as a type of action-adventure story. Like most good action-adventure war films, Henry V follows a hero whose actions culminate in a climactic battle that proves the mettle and validates his courage, morality, honor, and intelligence. Branagh's Henry V does all of that, as we will see. Let me say just a bit about audience empathy and emotion as in the battle scene. As Rick has noted, empathy is our most basic way of understanding others. When spectators watch actors performing actions on stage or in a film, they engage in embodied simulation as a means of getting to know the feelings, emotions, and social attitudes of their characters. Empathy is not the same as sympathy, as we know, but it can lead us to sympathize with some people and groups and not others. Watching the battle, we root for King Henry and the English tribe to win. Mirror mechanisms operate as well to trigger our emotions while watching the battle. Knowing those metal-tipped arrows can pierce medieval armor, we pity the French soldiers hit by them. We share in the king's anger and fear for his life as we watch him fight. And we probably wince when Nim, who steals the purse of a dead Frenchman, is stabbed by a French soldier. Our next film clip is Branagh's shortened version of Act 1. I think you can start it now. Act 1, Scene 2 from the play. There you will see the Archbishop of Canterbury, who colluded with Bishop Ely in the first scene of the play. Together, they plotted to turn the king's attention away from the confiscation of some church lands by promising to fund his invasion of France. Watch as Canterbury pursues this intention in the next scene with the king.
Where is my gracious Lord of Canterbury?
God and his angels guard your sacred throne and make you long become it.
Sure, we thank you. My learned lord, we pray you to proceed and justly and religiously unfold why the law Salic that they have in France, or should not bar us in our claim. And pray take heed how you impawn our person, how you awake our sleeping sword of war. We charge you in the name of God, take heed. For never two such kingdoms did contend without much fall of blood.
Then hear me, gracious sovereign. There is no bar to make against your highness' claim to France, but this, which they produce from Pharamond. In terram salicer mulieris ne succedent, no woman shall succeed in Salic land. Which Salic land the French unjustly gloze to be the realm of France. Yet their own authors faithfully affirm that the land Salic lies in Germany, between the floods of Saale and of Elbe. Then doth it well appear this Salic law was not devised for the realm of France, nor did the French possess the Salic land until 421 years after defunction of King Pharamond idly supposed the founder of this law. King Pepin, which deposed Childeric, did as heir general, being descended of Blithild, which was the daughter to King Clothaire, make claim and title to the crown of France. Hugh Capet also, who usurped the crown of Charles the Duke of Lorraine, sole heir male of the true line and stock of Charles the Great, could not keep quiet in his conscience, wearing the crown of France, till satisfied that fair Queen Isabel, his grandmother, was lineal of the Lady Ermengar, daughter to Charles, the aforesaid Duke of Lorraine, by the which marriage the line of Charles the Great was reunited to the crown of France. So that as clear as is the summer sun, all appear to hold in right and title of the female. So do the kings of France unto this day. Howbeit, they would hold up this Salic law to bar your highness claiming from the female.
May I, with right and conscience, make this claim?
The sin upon my head, dread sovereign. Stand for your own. Unwind your bloody flag.
Your brother kings and monarchs of the earth do all expect that you should rouse yourself, as did the former lions of your blood.
Never king of England had nobles richer and more loyal subjects whose hearts have left their bodies here in England and lie pavilioned in the fields of France.
Oh, let their bodies follow, my dear liege, with blood and sword and fire to win your right. In aid whereof, we of the spirituality will raise your highness such a mighty sum as never did the clergy at one time bring into any of your ancestors.
Call in the messengers sent from the Dauphin. Now are we well resolved, and by God's help and yours, the noble sinews of our power, France being ours, will bend it to our oar. or break it all to pieces.
Here, I'll talk about the way in which actors' action choices prompt subtle non-verbal signals that confirm, modify, or contradict the verbal meaning of the dialogue. In doing so, they create a sense of intersubjectivity amongst the characters and stimulate empathetic reactions through the careful use of both acting and directorial choices. Just prior to this extract, Branagh, as director, has given himself as actor a grand entrance, which nevertheless is consistent with narrative and context. He appeared as a silhouette in the lighted doorway that we see in this extract, then advances towards the camera, growing in size within the frame until he eclipses the doorway, a subliminal suggestion of metaphorically growing in stature. Branagh Henry is seated on the throne in a casual manner, an asymmetric posture, not upright, leaning against the chair back, suggesting ease with his social stature. In contrast with the king's entry, the two churchmen appear in the lit doorway, stooped and hurried, hastily approaching the camera that shows the king's point of view. In contrast to the king's entrance, they do not grow in size. These small details support a visual and behavioral statement about the supposed hierarchical status of the individuals in the scene, which is confirmed by Canterbury and Eli kneeling to the king. The topic of the scene is the moral justification for war. In this context, the cinematography has implied that the churchmen are morally small. The contrast between Henry and his advisors is heightened by choices of eye movement, in which mirror mechanisms are also present. Branagh Henry maintains a steady, unblinking visual sustain on Canterbury as he warns him. Canterbury is briefly shown in close-up with his eyes moving rapidly from side to side, suggesting discomfort and potentially deceit. The contrast of these eye movements suggests a more subtle statement of status. While previous actions were congruent with Henry's status as a king, these eye movements relate to the interpersonal status of the two men and also suggest thoughts that are not voiced. Henry's challenge, "We charge you in the name of God, take heed," seems to unsettle Canterbury. Branagh Henry's sustain shifts laterally to the nobleman and once again maintains a steady gaze that emphasizes the stern caution of "take heed, for never such two kingdoms did contend without much fall of blood." In response to this, Exeter shifts his gaze laterally, suggesting uncertainty, avoiding the king's gaze and making eye contact with the nobleman to his right. These detailed choices by the actors contrast a sense of directness in Henry's unwavering gaze, contrasted with the indirect movements, indirect eye movements of the churchmen and some of the nobles. We metaphorically associate directness with honesty and indirectness with evasion or deceit. These subtle promptings suggest collusion between the nobles and the churchmen, a theme that Bruce will pick up in talking about the play's original audiences. As Canterbury lays out his argument for the justness of Henry's cause, a significant change occurs in vocal inflections, with the variation of pitch communicating a sneering disdain for the French. Another vocal choice follows, this time of tempo, as Canterbury lists the ancestral lineage to the French crown in a rapid sing-song fashion. The actor playing Canterbury seems to be using actions of belittle and mock to suggest that the verbal information is of no true substance and should be discounted. The speech is delivered by Canterbury walking along the row of the seated nobles. We see the backs of their heads, with the camera panning to follow Canterbury's progress and keeping him in the center of the frame. The viewer is thus presented with the same view as the nobles, inviting us to also consider the validity of Canterbury's argument. At the end of this speech, Canterbury makes eye contact with Brian Blessed, playing Exeter, who nods and motions towards the king with an eye movement, suggesting collusion with Canterbury. Canterbury takes a position beside the king's throne to deliver the ironic statement that this is as clear as the sun, prompting laughter from the nobles, before once again kneeling to the king. Henry's question, "May I with right and conscience make this claim?" is framed in close-up, with Branagh Henry once again sustaining a direct gaze. Canterbury's response is supported by the approach of two nobles who visually and metaphorically back up the bishop, creating a line that directionally opposes the king, suggesting that he is outnumbered by those who we have seen colluding with one another. Bruce will shortly address this implicit narrative in the context of Shakespeare's 1599 audience.
So, as mentioned, I approach the question of audience empathy from the perspective of the paradigm of inaction, which understands empathy through a combination of phenomenology, evolution, and psychological system dynamics. Specifically, Evan Thompson's 4 stages of empathy, as presented in his 2007 book, Mind in Life, extends the process from its physiological beginnings in embodied simulation to possibilities for moral perception. Infants use their mirror mechanisms soon after birth to explore their world, but after about 9 months, they discover that other humans are also intentional agents like themselves, and they begin engaging in, quote, imaginary transposition. Thompson's 2nd stage of empathy, to begin understanding the intentions of others. Thompson calls the 3rd stage in empathetic development, quote, reiterated empathy, which is the ability to conceptualize oneself from the point of view of another person. His 4th level of empathy he calls moral perception, the underlying capacity to judge the actions of oneself and others as ethical agents. This normally occurs in 5 to 7-year-olds and opens them up to the social norms of their culture. Like the steps before it, this 4th level builds upon those preceding it. While this final empathic level, like the other 3, is a general part of human nature, it's clear that some children who grow into adults do not attain the possibility for moral perception. There's strong evidence, for example, that former President Donald Trump, who apparently lacks the capacity for guilt or shame, never reached it. Shakespeare and Branagh expect audiences to exercise empathic moral perception in the scene involving Canterbury, the nobles, and the king that we just watched. The scene poses the question of the ethical justification for the war that the archbishop and nobles apparently want the king to fight. But just because Henry has an ancient claim on those lands does not make it right to start a war to take them back. President Putin, for example, may claim that Russia has an ancient right to rule Ukraine, but most of the democratic world says that's not enough to justify the bloodshed and chaos that would be caused by an invasion. Now, the parallel between Russia now and England then is not exact, I know, but it's close enough to raise similar ethical concerns and questions. As Rick has mentioned, Branagh has Canterbury appealing first to the English nobles, who those in the 1599 audience knew would benefit directly from appropriating and taxing lands in France. Like the English Catholic Church, they want the fight, But why should Henry rush his kingdom into battle? From my perspective, Shakespeare raises the question of the king's justification for warfare in this early scene, but he refuses to answer it until the English victory at Agincourt. And he does this because he wants to test this heroic figure in English history to allow the audience to discover the qualities that make a good king. The spectators at Shakespeare's theater had already discovered that Prince Harry of Shakespeare's Henry IV parts 1 and 2 would already was a resourceful, honorable, and courageous prince. But what kind of king would he make is the question for Henry V. Does he reign with justice and gain God's blessing for his rule? The stakes are much higher, of course, for a king than a prince. They involve what I will call God's will for the tribe of the English. And this higher justification means that the king who leads them must face new and more extraordinary tests to justify his rule. When the battle is over and the king receives information about casualties on both sides, he reports that the English lost some 10,000 dead, or the French lost some 10,000 dead, excuse me, while the English suffered only about 30 killed in battle. Shakespeare accounts for this apparent miracle by having the king say, "God fought for us." And Branagh speaks that line with prayerful thanks in the film. In contrast, in the Salic law scene, God's grace seems ridiculously out of reach for England and its sovereign. By engaging only a modest amount of their empathy, the audience can see and hear the highest churchmen of medieval England collude with corrupt nobles to sway the king into waging a war that will clearly benefit all of them, but will also kill lots of English soldiers and possibly endanger the monarchy itself. Before Harry's ascent to the throne, England faced civil wars as a result of his father's killing of Richard II, the previously anointed king. Henry inherited a political and ethical mess when he became the sovereign. Is going to war in France really a good idea? Of course not. But the Lord works in mysterious ways to test the king for signs of godly rule. The first major task of King Harry, the first major task that Harry must do before he takes his army to France, is put down a conspiracy that plans to assassinate him. And as we'll see, God sends him several other trials, challenging him to assert his leadership in battle, shed the legacy of his sinful father, and recognize his fellow soldiers as a band of brothers. King Henry has several steep moral mountains to climb in order to win God's grace. So Shakespeare structured the narrative of Henry V to justify its historical ending. There's nothing unusual about this general strategy for dramatic writers. Most playwrights and many novelists begin their narratives knowing how their stories will end. With the miracle of Agincourt as the climax of his plot, Shakespeare certainly knew that the ethical growth of his protagonist could make an excellent drama. And that's what he decided to give us. We'll encounter one of the challenges eventually faced by the king in the next scene. As Shakespeare's audience knew, Prince Harry palled around with tavern lowlifes before he came king. And here you can start the next clip. He even led some of them in battle in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. Some of these characters appear in the next scene, and 3 of them are planning to return to war when the king takes his army to France. But what kind of soldiers will they make? How could the king fight an increasingly moral crusade in France with immoral soldiers? Let's meet Bardolph, Nym, and Pistol.
Now all the youth of England are on fire, and silken dalliance in the wardrobe lies. For now sits expectation in the air, and hides a sword from hilts unto the point, with crowns imperial, crowns and coronets promised to Harry and his followers.
Well met, Corporal Nim. Tomorrow, Lieutenant Bardolph. What, are you an ancient pistol? Friends yet? For my part, I care not. I say little. But when time shall serve, there shall be smiles. But that shall be as it may. Come, I will bestow a breakfast to make you friends, and we'll be all three sworn brothers to France. Let it be so, good Corporal Nim. I will do as I may. It is certain, Corporal, that ancient Pistol is married to Nell Quickly. And certainly she did you wrong, for you were betrothed to her. How now, mine host Pistol?
Base, tyke! Callest thou me host now by this hand? I swear I scorn the term! Nor shall my Nell keep lodgers!
No, by my troth, not long. For we cannot lodge or board a dozen or 14 gentlewomen who live honestly by the prick of their needles. But it shall be thought we keep a bawdy house straight.
Peace! This for thee, Iceland dog!
Good Corporal Nim, show thy valour and put up thy sword.
Will you shog off? Pistol, I will prick your guts a little in good terms as I may. That's the humour of it.
Braggart vile!
Hear me what I say. He that strikes the first stroke, I'll run him up to the hilts, as I'm a soldier.
An oath of mickle might, and fury shall abate.
My host, Pistol! You must come to my master, and you, hostess. He's very sick and would to bed. Good Bardolph, put thy face between his sheets and do the office of a warming pan.
Away, you rogue.
Faith, he's very ill.
On my troth, the king has killed his heart. Good husband, come in presently.
This extract that we've just seen immediately follows the conclusion of the previous scene in which Henry has resolved to make war on France. The rousing nature of Henry's speech and the music that accompanies it was given an ironic touch by a look exchanged between the two churchmen who have persuaded Henry to declare war. This reminds us of their less than honorable motives. This momentary irony is then compounded by the stark juxtaposition of the king's court with the lowly tavern in the clip that we've just seen. This juxtaposition is intentional both in Shakespeare's play and in Branner's film. Shakespeare frequently contrasts the actions of nobles with those of people of lower social status. In comedies, the romantic travails of aristocrats are often mirrored by servants. This serves both to heighten the humor and to make the plot more accessible for the broad social mix of audience members in the globe. In this play, the juxtaposition serves nuanced narrative and thematic purposes, some of which I will examine and some of which Bruce will expand upon later. For both of us, the voiceover from the character of the chorus at the beginning of this clip is significant, and we'll each emphasize different aspects of that choice in complementary ways. In Shakespeare's script, the chorus introduces the play in a prologue that makes explicit reference to the fiction of the play and to the material circumstances of its performance in the Globe Theatre. The chorus apologizes for the inadequacy of the theatre's resources to portray the vasty fields of France and asks the audience's permission to let us on your imaginary forces work. Evidently, Branner's filmmaking makes different kinds of demands on the audience's imaginations, as he can create visually literal depictions of the vasty fields of France. So why has he chosen to maintain the presence of the chorus, who disrupts the visual environments of the late medieval period by appearing in modern-day clothing? Obviously, Branner wants to include some of the wonderful poetry spoken by the chorus, "Oh, for a muse of fire." But perhaps more significantly, this choice allows Branner to use the narrator function of the chorus and the meta-theatrical disruption of the heroic narrative of Henry's growth as a king and England's war with France. The chorus's line at the beginning of this extract, "Now all the youth of England are on fire," creates an ironic contrast between the supposed patriotic fervor of the English people and the poverty and degradation of a tavern that is also a brothel. The device of overlaying the speech of the chorus sustains the meta-theatrical impact of this character, whose commentary becomes ironic, as we hear the chorus say, "For now expectation sits in the air and hides a sword from hilts unto the point, with crowns imperial, crowns and coronets promised to Harry and his followers." We see a ragged, unshaven and dirty Bardolph searching for food and drink among the leftovers in the tavern, then clearing a cat from food that he then eats. Bruce will refer to one of the emotions evoked by this and its implications. Another layer of meaning rests on the fact that there are no crowns or coronets visible here. The war that will enrich Henry and his nobles may also provide crowns, in the monetary sense of the word, to his impoverished soldiers, Corporal Nym and Lieutenant or Lieutenant Bardolph. In a grotesque foreshadowing of Henry's wooing of Catherine, Nym is disconsolate that Pistol has married Mistress Quickly, to whom he was betrothed. The potential violence that this stirs is first forestalled by Bardolph and then prevented by news of the illness of a character, Falstaff, who was a companion of both the low-life thieves of the tavern and of Henry when he was Prince Hal. Henry has forsworn Falstaff's company on ascending to the throne, which is what prompts Mistress Quickly to say, "Upon my troth, the king has killed his heart." Her tears will likely evoke sadness or compassion in audiences, a directorial intent that is confirmed by the musical underscoring that now becomes audible. As an audience, we have witnessed and potentially empathized with a rapid progression of different emotions in this scene, all of them related in subtle ways to the main plot.
As Rick has noted, the chorus tells us at the beginning of the act, "Now all the youth of England are on fire," to join the king's army and fight for honor. But this first scene shows us two lowlifes, Nym and Pistol, who are more intent on fighting each other over a woman than fighting together against the French. Shakespeare is clear that the possibilities of medieval warfare attracted all kinds of riffraff who were out for individual profit, not courage, honor, or tribal glory. As portrayed in Branner's movie, the contrast between the king's high motives and the low morality of Nym and Pistol probably sparked disgust in most spectators. At the same time, though, the quickness of their anger and the passion behind their claims to righteousness are also meant to question the king's early actions. The film's narrative shows that Henry, too, desires to avenge slights to his honor, and his righteousness, if certainly better spoken, is equally vehement. What kind of war can Henry lead if most of his soldiers are so selfish and undisciplined? That question is answered in the first set battle of the invasion, when Henry rallies his forces at the siege of Harfleur. The English open a breach in the walls of the city, but are initially beaten back by the French. Mounted on a white horse, Branagh's Henry urges, "Once more under the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead." This rousing speech climaxes with, "Follow your spirit, and upon my charge cry, God for Harry, England, and St. George." The soldiers repeat his battle cry and charge through the opening. While most of the English pour themselves into the breach, Bardolph, Pistol, and Nym stand safely aside and hypocritically urge them on. Says Bardolph in apparent mockery, "On, on, 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 to the breach, to the breach." But as the three cowards begin to slink away, Captain Fluellen stops them and then tries to force them to join the others. Pistol makes some excuses, Fluellen is called away, the moment soon passes, but it's clear that these three lowlifes do no fighting at Harfleur or anywhere else in France. After the victory, the king, recognizing that he must tighten the discipline of his army, forbids his troops from looting churches. Bardolph, however, steals a communion plate, and the king reluctantly agrees that he must be hung as an example to the rest of the army. In the film, as the English march toward Agincourt under drizzling rain, they pass under Bardolph's dangling body. We've already seen that Nym will be killed at Agincourt. Following Shakespeare, Branagh makes sure that spectators have little pity for Bardolph or Nym. We're almost happy to find that both of them get their just desserts for their selfishness and cowardice in France. At the end of the play, Captain Fluellen, the Welshman, who has become a favorite of the former Prince of Wales, stands as the model commoner in Henry's army. This alignment also appears as a part of God's plan for the English tribe. The audience watches as the king's army easily incorporates Scots, Welsh, and even Irish soldiers into his victorious army. The miracle of Agincourt legitimates the righteous spread of English rule to all the lands in the British Isles. We might call this English imperialism, but Shakespeare's ending invites us to understand that it's actually heavenly justice. But the king himself still has more work to do before he can stand as God's chosen at Agincourt. On the night before the battle, recognizing his moral responsibility for the welfare of his men, he disguises himself and seeks out despondent English soldiers to buck up their confidence and assure them that the king and his cause are just. In his final prayer to God, he asks the Lord to temporarily overlook his father's killing of King Richard, and promises to continue his many acts of contrition and penitence for his father's mortal sin. Knowing how the battle turns out, we can assume that spectators in 1599 believed the Lord was listening and helped the English to victory. This next scene, already queued up, is set just before sunrise on the morning of the battle.
Where is the king? The king himself is rode to view their battle.
Of fighting men, they have full 70,000.
That's 5 to 1. Besides, they are all fresh.
'Tis a fearful odds.
Oh, that we now had here but 1/10,000 of those men in England that do no work today.
What's he that wishes so? My cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Rather, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand at tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly, on the vigil, feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day! My sovereign lord, bestow yourself with speed. The French are bravely in their battle set, and will with all expedients march upon us. All things are ready if our minds be so.
Perish the man whose mind is backward now.
Thou dost not wish more help from England, cuz?
God's will, my liege. Would you and I alone, without more help, can fight this royal battle?
You know your places. God be with you all.
At the beginning of our talk, I described the way in which actors action their dialogue, and that these choices can confirm, modify, or contradict verbal meaning. In this clip, Branner's choices as an actor both support Shakespeare's rhetoric and surprise the listeners in the fictional circumstances, and by extension, the viewers. Sophisticated choices make a well-known speech both fresh and fully credible in its result of inspiring the assembled troops. I'll give some examples. On hearing Westmoreland's wish to have more soldiers, Branner Henry's line, "Who's he that wishes so?" could be, "I question," but this is not a strong action choice. Given the life or death circumstances, the action could legitimately be, "I demand" or "I challenge," choices that would suit an authoritarian commander. But Branner's choice seems to be, "I tease," with an unexpected affection and humor. In contrast to the grim and fearful expressions of the nobles, he begins his speech with a half smile and a physical relaxation that implies confidence, even happiness, a happiness that anticipates the verbal content of the line, "We happy few," at the end of the speech. The camera follows Westmoreland as he approaches Henry, giving us both his point of view and the sense that we are part of the group that Henry gesturally invites to join him. Branner Henry tilts his head to the side on we are enough to do our country loss, suggesting the action I appraise, and then pushes his chin up and forward on and if to live, with an action of I defy. On the fewer men, the greater share of honor, there is an unexpected softening of vocal tone, contrasted by a raised forearm and hand, which becomes a fist with greater muscular tension to suggest I challenge. On God's will, I pray thee wish not one man more. On rather proclaim it, Westmoreland, that he hath no stomach for this fight, let him depart. There is a casual nod to the side and a facial expression of a shrug implying it doesn't matter, followed by a micro smile implying that no blame shall be attached to those who depart. The verbal meaning of his passport shall be made is contradicted by another gesture of follow me. The line and crowns for convoy put in his purse recalls the promise of crowns made by the chorus in the voiceover in the tavern scene, a recall that is strengthened by the sight of Nym and Pistol waiting at the cart, with Nym lending a hand to Henry to help him step up onto the cart. The visual action of support implies that at this moment, even the self-serving thieves metaphorically support Henry. Branner Henry links this support to love through the affectionate gesture of clasping the boy Robin's neck for the line, "He that outlives this day and comes safe home." In many traditions of acting, there is a dictum that one cannot act an emotion, but that one can perform actions that prompt emotion in the actor and or the audience. Paradoxically, in a call to arms speech, the action that Branner uses to speak, "we few, we happy few," seems to be "I love." It is spoken softly and seriously with tears in his eyes. The accumulated implication of the actions combined with the language is that Henry's love creates inclusion in a community in which the honor of being able to die with us is of greater value than the money represented by the crowns. The prospect of immortality through perpetual remembrance in one's home is added to this honor if one survives. Bruce will now explain the broader implications of these cognitive and affective choices.
In discussing the likely audience response to Henry V, I've been emphasizing the importance of Christian belief and morality in the narrative arc of the play. This major theme would certainly have appealed to Shakespeare's contemporaries in 1599, but we know as well that the claim "God fought for England" probably carried little credibility for many audience members who saw the movie in 1989. Yet Branagh's film had wide appeal 33 years ago, and live performances of Shakespeare's action-adventure play continued to be applauded by theatrical spectators around the world in the years since then. I expect the play will regain its popularity when the current pandemic subsides. So in this final section of our discussion, I'd like to ask, what is it about Henry V that has appealed to most spectators for over 400 years and will likely continue to do so? And I believe that the St. Crispin's Day speech holds the key to the play's broad and continuing popularity. Yes, Henry's pep talk to the troops continues to underline several Christian themes, but its rhetorical urgency appeals to a universal proclivity shared by almost all Homo sapiens, regardless of their nation or religion. The speech arouses our altruism. Altruism is closely related to the successful group dynamics of our evolution. When individuals willingly put aside their own and their family's gratification to work together for the success of a group, they engage in altruism. Other primate species cooperate to a degree, but only humans will sacrifice their immediate desires for long-term gains. The key to the psychology of altruism is the hormone oxytocin, which often bonds together sports teams, actors cast in the same play, and military units trained to fight together in battle. Oxytocin heightens empathic perceptions and similar emotions in human groups, making cooperation easier. Unfortunately, oxytocin also powers an aversion to outsiders and strangers, those others who easily become the enemy when an altruistic group is fighting a battle. What better way, then, to prepare soldiers to fight at Agincourt or to die trying than to rouse their altruistic oxytocin? The King's speech begins on the theme of honor, as we've seen, but it soon becomes clear that honor is no longer a badge of individual courage, but a pledge to the fraternal right to die together as a group, if need be. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. Let such men depart, says the King. Those that stay to fight, whether alive or dead at the end of the battle, shall be remembered, he promises. At the end of his speech, the King emphasizes the togetherness of the group and his membership in it. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood shall be my brother. Most of us have experienced the solidarity, pride, and often the accompanying aggression of altruism. We know what it's like to work together toward a common goal and succeed as a group. Oftentimes, an inspired leader has successfully overcome many obstacles to lead us toward such success. And whatever our social, political, or religious affiliations, we can enjoy re-experiencing these altruistic emotions every time we watch and applaud Henry V. Thank you for both of us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, many interesting themes, topics, and issues. Let's see if someone in the audience is willing to start the discussion. Questions are welcome. In the meantime, perhaps I can break the ice, as we say in Italy, and propose a first issue for discussion. You've been talking about acting technique, what it might accomplish with respect to the audience reaction. So my question deals, I'm fully aware it's pretty late and the issue is rather big, but I'm very curious. I can't refrain from asking the question anyway. Where do you see the main difference between acting this Shakespeare piece on the big screen with respect to doing it on stage? Some actors, I think Brian himself did both. So where do you see the key differences in performing the role, uttering the same words, but without relying on close-ups, stereo sounds. Well, sound effects now are popular in theater too, but definitely is a completely different environment with respect to the movie theater. So,
yeah,
Rick, why don't you start?
Yeah. Surely, Bruce. Yes, thank you, Vittorio. Yes, it's a really significant question, and one that is very alive in actor training. Obviously, what tends to happen in actor training is that actors are trained first of all in the techniques and style that will work on stage, and then develop more subtlety to work on camera. It's a truism in actor training to say that the main difference is the size of what we do, both literally and metaphorically. So on stage, for example, one needs to amplify one's voice, project into the auditorium, but also to amplify one's gestures. Something that film does very well, as you mentioned, is to give us close-ups of eye movements and even micro facial expressions, even the blink of an eye. And so actors who can work both on stage and on screen tend to seek to find the impulse, and I know that's a debated concept in neuroscience, but seek to find the phenomenological sense of an impulse that will provoke behavior on stage, which they can then amplify. On screen, they would be seeking to find the same impulse, but express it more in the dimension that we would use in daily life, where we would simply be in conversation with someone else. Something that happens also on camera is that actors have to be very precise in their movements and behavior because of the focal range of camera, as I know you are familiar with from your writing. And so, in a sense, there is a greater or perhaps a different type of technique involved in on-screen acting than on stage. For me, another significant difference, and it's one of the reasons that I prefer working on stage than on camera, is that when we're working on stage, the narrative is continual, and one, as an actor, engages oneself in the imaginative world of the drama, whereas when we're on film, obviously, we're all familiar with the fact that many takes occur. It takes ages to get the lighting right and body position and so on. So one of the challenges for a film actor is the ability to maintain their imaginative connection with the fictional circumstances whilst all of that other stuff is going on, and then appear truthful and credible when they're ready to take the shot. So obviously that hasn't answered your question in the fullest way, but it gives us some sense of what the challenges are.
Thank you.
I'll just add a few things, if I may. Rick has rightly noted the differences, but I think it's important to also note the similarities. We are still, simulating the experience of another person and projecting ourselves into that role. We are still playing actions, from one beat to the next. Many of the basics continue, regardless of the medium of acting. The other thing, just to move to spectating for a moment here, I was reminded again of how important the music is, especially in the Band of Brothers speech. We have this stirring music that almost crowds out Branagh's wonderful speech. It reminded me that I would as thrilling as the music is, I would almost prefer to hear Branagh make his own music, and you know, listen to him do it on stage, because he doesn't need any help, for heaven's sakes. Yeah, that's enough.
Thanks.
And I wonder if it may ask you a question, Vittorio. It's something that I've long been interested in. I know that you've mentioned in some of your writings the fact that a mediated performance is less powerful in stirring empathy through embodied simulation than a live performance. And I've often thought that one of the reasons that film uses musical underscoring so much in contrast to stage is that the music is there to, if you like, amplify the emotional reaction.
Emphasize, underline,
Right.
My interest, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, is what are the mechanisms that dictate that difference between a response to a live performance on stage and a performance to a mediated performance?
Well, to be honest, the short answer is that we don't know. Actually, we wrote a research project where we were, among other things, specifically focusing on this aspect of mediation, to which extent different mediations, different mediatic context affect, if they do, the reception on the audience side of the same content. So, for example, we were planning to compare live attendance of a live performance with digitally mediated bidimensional rendition of the same performance and virtual reality, an immersive experience of the same performance through the headset. A further element we would be interested to learn more about is to which extent, which comes handy with the massive development of streaming platforms, to which extent the sharing of the experience affects the way we receive a given performance, and eventually whether the sharing through different media introduces differences. You know what I mean? Sitting in the audience physically side by side versus being alone in the same audience, and compared to sharing the experience in front of a screen or sharing the experience with other avatars that I'm aware of within the grant application wasn't fortunate, so I guess we'll have to wait. And also, to add more to this crucial issue you brought up, we know very little also beside the issue of fiction. Most of what we claim to know about the relationship between brain behavior and reality, physical reality, is the outcome of experiments being done where reality is compressed into its representation on a bidimensional screen or on a pair of goggles that participants lying in the scanner wear, and through which they become aware of the various stimuli our colleagues are interested in investigating the brain correlate of. So there are very, very few experiments where people were able to compare the experience of something happening physically in front of the participant with its bidimensional digital rendition. On average, in these few studies that I'm aware of, the response tend to be stronger with a physically present agent you are beholding with respect to. But for example, it comes to my mind a study done by colleagues recording mirror neurons in macaques at Tübingen University. It was published 11 years ago. They were systematically comparing the response of mirror neurons to an agent physically present in front of the macaque performing the action with its display on a bidimensional computer screen. All neurons responded to both. All of them. Half responded with a higher intensity to the physical presence. The remaining half responded equally to both. And this is quite interesting because we are dealing with a species which is well before the invention of language.
Sure.
Which means that action, movement, embodiment is so powerful that even in a species which is, roughly speaking, 25 million years older than our species, no matter what the mediation is, that body comes across no matter what, to the extent to trigger the response of a mechanism that clearly is much older than the invention of computer screens.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I notice Marta has raised a virtual hand.
Yeah, my virtual hand. Yeah.
Please, Marta.
Because I have several questions. In part, you already answered about the differences between acting on stage and acting in front of a camera, and it's something that I'm interested in, and we already tried to investigate this topic through a study, and so I would like to see this from another point of view. So, what changes for an actor in terms of the relationship with the audience when he's or she's approaching to act in front of an audience that is in the theater in front of him or her, and when she's approaching to act in front of a camera? I have experience of the first case, so acting on a stage, not acting in front of a camera. I know that could be that there are other people around, but I think it's a different kind of audience. So what do you think?
Again, a really, really interesting and significant question. I should start by saying that we focused in our talk on a style of acting which is known as realism, and it's the most ubiquitous style. And in the style of realism, which originates in its training with the Russian actor and director Konstantin Stanislavski, in this style, the actor is encouraged to ignore the presence of the audience in order, and in my perception, to better focus on the imagined circumstances, on the fictional circumstances. So in this style of realism, when an actor is on stage, they are seeking to take away the awareness or the sense of the audience, and therefore not consciously thinking, I am doing this in order to provoke this reaction in the audience. They're seeking to avoid that. That might be present, nevertheless, and obviously actors will notice if an audience laughs or briefly applauds within a scene. But when that happens, they will seek to attach their mental focus to the fictional circumstances. And I think in a way the same dictum operates with film acting, in that obviously at one level the actor is aware that what they do will eventually affect an audience when they watch the film, but they are seeking to create behavior that appears credible and natural. And often what we find is that if we're thinking of how will this affect the audience, the behavior starts to appear less natural and less spontaneous, and therefore counterproductive to actually having an effect on the audience. It's a very imperfect response, but I hope it gives some sense of how we approach it.
Sure.
For example, once I watched an interview to Michael Caine, and Michael Caine was interviewed about his relationship with a camera. I think he was lecturing students about acting in front of a camera, and he was since that interview I keep looking at how often the actors, particularly when it's shot in a close-up, like in some of the scene you offer to us this afternoon, how many times the actor blinks. Because he was saying you don't want to blink at all. You want to keep your eyes open, focused. And he was showing acting the same line without blinking and with blink, and the effect was incredible. So I think this, while acting on stage, since you don't have the equivalent of a close-up, is probably, is it less relevant, or the blink, no matter what, affects your focus on the line? What do you think, since you have acting experience? Do you focus on how many times you blink when you are on stage, or you don't?
I hope not.
On stage, it's generally not something that we think of.
That you pay attention.
And again, in the style of realism, the encouragement is always to focus on the imagined life, the imagined circumstances, and then let behavior happen in response to that imagination. Now, one phenomenon that is frequently talked about, both in actor training and in practice, is something that gets called dual consciousness. Now, obviously, in cognitive terms, this is a very imprecise notion. But the phenomenological experience for actors is that they find their attention shifting rapidly between the fictional circumstances and the actual literal physical circumstances, often at a speed that makes it seem as though those two perceptions are simultaneous. Some actors have talked about a phenomenon whereby they see themselves as if from above whilst they're on stage, whilst they're also playing within the fictional circumstances. There's a famous account of that from a contemporary of Stanislavski's named Michael Chekhov, who was the nephew of the playwright Anton Chekhov. And it's a phenomenon that I started to think of when I became interested in cognitive science as potentially oscillation, but then realized that that sense of oscillation isn't a good one if we think about neural patterns. And so one of the things I'd be very interested to hear from both of you is how we could think of that phenomenological experience of dual consciousness from a point of view of neuroscience.
Very, very complex issue. I think, if you allow me to joke, since it's Friday evening, neuroscience has already much trouble in grappling with one single consciousness. I mean, there are many theories, many models, many options, and for example, now it's becoming more and more fashionable, a sort of panpsychism. There are colleagues that are pushing the idea of panpsychism very hard, which, in my opinion, betrays the total unsatisfactory state of the art. I mean, let me be frank. I mean, I really encourage people to do neuroscience because I think it offers a supplementary window onto the anthropological dimension of mankind. it's necessary but not sufficient, okay, to be crude. But quite often it is portrayed, particularly in the media, as the repository of all knowledge about practically everything. And I think this fires back, particularly when you start dealing with people in the humanities. You bring along this aura of knowing already everything, and which scares people. But it's quite the opposite. We know very little. I mean, we know a lot more than we did 40 years ago. But at the same time, we know less, because the deeper you get, for example, take emotions. This afternoon, you discussed emotions were a crucial ingredient of your analysis of acting and the specific example you offered us. Well, today, you see the pendulum of constructivism bringing us back to the 30s of the last century. There are colleagues like Lisa Feldman Barrett, for example, to name one, who is challenging fiercely Paul Ekman, the idea that anything like basic emotion really exists. So here comes really highly relevant to this debate, even within the neuroscience, the contribution of the humanities. Because I remember a line by Pat Hogan that you, Bruce, were quoting about the universal. He also has a website on universal in narrative and literature. And he was saying, well, neuroscientists should better learn more about fictional narrative, because that's where you learn a lot about what emotions really are. So my question to you is, to which extent do you think that the idea of universals in fiction narrative still hold? And to which extent do you think it might contribute to this really heated debate that is going on in our camp?
You know, I tend to agree quite a bit with Giovanna Colombetti. Okay. Do you know her work? Okay, and she doesn't have the same affection for universals in emotion. She tends, it seems to me, to break them down into all kinds of different component parts, and enjoy the fact that they often get mixed up quite a bit. And so I don't think Hogan is so much right about emotions being universal. It seems to me that emotions are the wrong place to look for universals. Hogan has more success, I believe, when he's talking about narrative types, narrative stories. You can debate, how many actual plots are there in that we have inherited from our ancestors. But it's clear that there are certain kinds of ways of seeing the world that embody narrative types, and that they recur throughout seemingly all of the cultures of the world. So I follow Hogan there, but I don't agree with notions of kind of standard normative emotion.
Yeah, I think much of the problem comes from the fact that nature is dimensional, language is categorical. So to the extent that you try to force categories on any realm, natural realm, the same occurs with nosography, DSM, for example, and mental disease, mental sufferance. The same issue is being repeated in a variety of domains. I think we are all human beings, so the bricks are universal. the constitutive elements, the body is a human body, period.
Right.
No matter where you are, no matter what the culture you grew up with might be different or more similar. And so in a way, it's to the extent that you try to define a rigid line between universality and cultural specificity, you tell only part of the truth. It's true that there are cultural differences. In the city where I live, as long as you cross the river, the accent gets different. Some words in the dialect may be pronounced differently. Sure. You drive along Via Emilia, the same kind of food is denominated with different names. And you drive just 15 miles to experience that. So it's clear that there are cultural differences, but I don't see that cultural differences are enough to question the basic fabric of human nature, which to the extent that you allow the body to play its role, which is a major role, it's the grounding element for everything, then I think these two dimensions can be reconciled, beside the fact that this kind of cultural or scientific wars are justified by other elements which also belong to our species, which you want to assert your own position and challenge.
Yeah, that's right.
If we get to the bottom of it, I think they can coexist. At least this is my view.
Well, I think they do coexist, and that's part of the way in which they work. Universals only play out in specific particulars. One has to go to the root, however, of what that universal is to even define it in that way. So I think there's a play between universal and particular that unfortunately it's become a kind of either or question when it's always been a both and.
Yeah, I fully agree with you.
It's not, it's not something that is one or the other. Yeah.
And any question from the audience?
Yeah, otherwise I have another one. Okay, I'll go. I'm particularly interested in the capacity and the expertise of the actors and actresses in using their body. You mentioned also taking advantage of the scene that we show us, the gestures, the nonverbal language. So could we think as the actor's body as a case of study for science, as a particular case of study, let's say, for a scientist to study emotions, to study nonverbal language, as you told, because of this expertise developed through physical training mainly, I guess.
Yeah, I personally think that actors would be a very, very good topic or subject to examine this, because our phenomenological experience is that if we're successful in connecting with the imagined circumstances, the experience that we have of emotions does not feel different from emotions that occur in response to stimuli in daily life. Right. So we feel as though they are as real as those that we experience in daily life. There's frequently variation from one performance to the next. And so if one is performing the same piece in multiple performances on stage night after night, one might feel a great strength of emotion at one point on one performance, but not in the next. Nevertheless, one has to maintain the appearance of that emotion for the audience. So in terms of using actors as subjects of study for emotion, I think there would be a lot of potential interest in looking at stimuli that operate in different contexts. One of the things that we're very conscious of when we act, and Bruce and I have looked at this, is the notion that anything that happens for an actor is happening within an intersubjective context, which is dynamical, where all the components of the context are simultaneously affecting one another. And clearly, you know, with the very little that I know about how one can construct studies, it would be very difficult to isolate variables within that intersubjective environment. Nevertheless, I think it's worth trying. I'm familiar with some, and there have been very few studies where actors have been placed in fMRI chambers. And here I think the way that one conceptualizes the study, what questions one asks, is crucial in determining what sort of information one will arrive with. So, for example, there's a neuroscientist at McMaster University, Stephen Brown, who has I think it's called a neuro arts lab, who has conducted a study with actors in an fMRI chamber and has noticed differences that are observable in the different regions of the brain and the degree of oxygenated blood flow and so on. However, the initial structure of his study was based on asking the actors, first of all, to speak as themselves, and then to speak as the characters. Yeah. And obviously, this is a very, very fluid sense. Am I me? Am I the character? Am I me as the character? From that point, I began to wonder, is it possible to find combinations of technologies? For example, setting up a study where one could use EEG nets and then finding something similar or comparable where one is using an fMRI chamber.
And the heart too, right? The autonomic system. So let's do it.
Yes. All we need is the fun.
Let's do it. I mean, it's challenging. It's very difficult because, as I said, our techniques are very crude. Although they are so highly sophisticated, but still very crude. So, as I always say, it's like looking at the world through a peeping hole. It's a caricature of real life and reality. Because you must be in control of all the variables, you have time limitation. Definitely fMRI for acting, I probably is not the best solution because it's so artificial, so claustrophobic, EEG or the combination of the EEG and the response of the autonomic system, like we, with Marta and others, try to do in Venice with the actors. We try also to use infrared cameras to detect temperature variation, which is a technique which is developing, but not as sharp as recording directly from the heart. But now you can do it wireless. We tried wireless, but it didn't work. It only worked when we wired the bodies of the audience to the ECG instruments. So there are technical problems, but can be solved. Now you can use wireless EEG. It's something that is worth being pursued, and we are open to collaborate with you on this topic if you're interested, because it's only through the collaboration with people who know what acting is all about that you can dare to scratch the surface of it from a neurobiological point of view. Otherwise, there's no point in doing that. So let's think about it. Yeah.
Yes, please. I'd be delighted to collaborate, and thank you for the invitation. That would be marvelous.
Yeah, indeed. So
right.
It's 7:30. If there are no other chances, if there is anything you would like to add to what you gave us today, for which we are really deeply grateful, we could call it.
Well, thank you very much again for the invitation. It was a pleasure to pull this together.
Yeah, for us too.
Yeah,
very much.
Thank you so much, both for the invitation, but also for the great body of work that you have produced.
Right.
As
Yes.
you know, I have personally been very enthused to discover the concepts of embodied cognition and how resonant they are with acting practice. I find it extremely exciting. And many scholars, many colleagues also have that sense of excitement. So I hope that we can proceed. And thank you again.
Yeah. Let's go for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And have a great weekend. Everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.